Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to use the Excel functions SUMIF and SUMIFS. Data analysts use these two functions all the time for aggregating data, creating reports, creating Excel tools, and so much more. So first I'm going to show you how to use these two functions, and then we're actually going to build a simple tool where we can select options from lists of inputs and get results based on our selections. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so just to familiarize you with the data set a little bit, this is a made-up table. I created this data myself, but it's a downtime log for a collection of solar sites, particularly a downtime log for the month of September in 2023. So each time that a solar site or a component on a solar site went down, the date was recorded, the hours of downtime was recorded, and the total megawatt hours or electricity lost was also recorded. So column A lists the solar site that had issues. Column B lists the date when the issue started. Column C is the device that had issues, either an inverter or an entire solar site. Column D is the total hours of downtime for each instance. And column E is the total megawatt hours lost for each instance. So if I wanted to know how many megawatt hours were lost at solar site 3, well, I could just manually filter by solar site 3 and then just add up the megawatt hours lost at this particular site. But that's not good practice because anytime that I add additional data to this table, I would have to go back and recalculate how many megawatt hours were lost at site 3. So we need a way to automate it, and that's why we use SUMIF. So SUMIF is very simple. We're just going to type in equals SUMIF, open parentheses, and the first input or argument is the range. The range is going to be the column of data that I want to look for to meet my criteria. So our criteria is site 3, and all of our solar sites are listed in column A. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the entire column A. I choose to select the whole column because that just ensures that if I were to go back and add additional data to my table, it will be accounted for in my function. Add a comma to move on to my next argument, which is the criteria. We already said that the criteria is site 3, which I'm going to type out in quotation marks, keeping in mind that anything in quotation marks is case sensitive. Add another comma for my final argument, which is the sum range. And the sum range is just going to be the collection of data that you want to sum if it meets your criteria. We're looking for a total number of megawatt hours, which is going to be in column E. So once again, I'm going to select the entire column E. Now I'll just close my parentheses and hit enter. Now let's say we want to know how many hours of downtime occurred at site 1 due to inverter outages. Well, now we have two criteria. In the first question, we just had one criteria. We were essentially just sorting by site 3. But in the second question, we want to sort by site 1 and inverter outages. So anytime we have more than one criteria, we need to use SUMIFs. So I'm going to type in equals SUMIFs, open parentheses. The order of the arguments in SUMIFs is a little bit different than in SUMIF, so just make sure you're paying attention to that. The first argument is the sum range. So we're starting with the collection of data that we want to sum if it meets our criteria. We are asked for a total number of hours of downtime. So my sum range is going to be column D. And once again, I'm going to select the entire column. My second argument is criteria range 1. So this is going to be the collection of data where we're going to find our first criteria. So our first criteria is site 1, which means that our criteria range is going to be in column A, where we would find site 1. Our third argument is criteria 1, which we already said is site 1. And again, keep in mind that anything that you put in quotation marks is case sensitive. Now, technically, you could use SUMIFs even if you only have one criteria. So we could stop here and just find how many hours of downtime occurred at site 1. Just something to keep in mind. But we're going to keep going because we have two criteria. So our next argument is criteria range 2, and our second criteria is inverter outages. So we need to find the collection of data where we would find inverter outages. That's going to be in column C. And our final argument is criteria 2, which we already determined was inverter outages, but I want to make sure that my criteria in quotation marks matches the data that is in my criteria range. So instead of typing inverter outages, I'm just going to type inverter. Now I'll just close my parentheses and hit enter. And there we go. We had 39.64 hours of downtime at site 1 due to inverter outages. So now that we know how to use SUMIF and SUMIFs, Let's do a real world practice problem where you can see how a data analyst might actually use these functions. So we're going to create just a really simple Excel tool. And the purpose of this tool is to be able to select a solar site and select a device. And based on which site and which device you choose, you will be able to see the megawatt hours lost and the hours of downtime for your selections. So we're going to be a little fancy here and we're going to add a drop-down menu. To do that, you're going to select the cell where you want your drop-down menu and you're going to come up to the Data tab and you're going to click Data Validation. Under Allow, we're going to click List and we want to select a site. So we want our selections to be the list of solar sites available. So I'm going to type Site 1, add a comma, Site 2, add a comma, Site 3, add a comma, and Site 4. Now I'll just click OK. And now we have a drop-down menu so we can select a solar site instead of having to manually type it into this box. And I'm going to do the same thing for selecting a device. So again, in the Data tab, I'm going to click Data Validation, List. And I want to note that for the source, you could actually click this little box here. And if you had a list of devices or a list of solar sites, you could actually just click and drag your list of devices or solar sites or whatever you want to be as your input. And that would be a faster way to do it, but I don't have a list of devices or a list of solar sites, so I'm just going to manually type it in. So my source is either going to be an inverter or a site, or we could look at downtime for both inverters and sites. So I'm going to add that as an option as well. Click OK. And now we have a drop down for devices. All right, so now we get to have fun. So I'm going to click into the cell where I want my answer to be displayed. And let's think this through. What do we actually want to appear in this box? Well, we want to see the megawatt hours that are lost from this site and this device. So we have two criteria, which means that we're going to use SUMIFS. All right, so my sum range is going to be megawatt hours lost. So I'm going to come back to my Data tab and highlight column E where I can find megawatt hours lost. My next argument is the criteria range 1, so I'm going to select the entire column A. The third argument is criteria 1, and when we did our practice problems, we just manually typed in site 1 or site 2, but we want our answer to change based on which site we've chosen in our drop-down menu. So instead of manually typing in site 2, I'm going to select the column where I have my drop-down menu to select a site. Add a comma, and now my fourth argument is criteria range 2, which is going to be a device. So I'm going to select the entire column C. And my criteria 2, again, we're not going to manually type that in. We're going to select the cell with the dropdown for a device. Now just close my parentheses and hit enter. And we get an error. What happened? So this is just a little Excel tip. Anytime you're using SUMIF, you can only reference one cell. And here we're referencing G9 through H9. And again, here we're referencing I9 through J9. So technically, even though these two cells are merged and these two cells are merged, Excel thinks that I'm referencing more than one cell. So to fix the problem, we just need to only choose one of those cells. Hit enter. And now we don't have a problem. I can click any site I want and the data will automatically populate. I can click from site to inverter, but if I click inverters plus site, I get 0. That doesn't seem right. If I'm looking at both inverters plus the site, it should be the total megawatt hours lost from the inverters and from the site as a whole. So why is it 0 when it's 166 for just inverters? The problem is that this input, inverters plus site, is not listed in my criteria range. There are no data points that say inverter plus site. It's either inverter or site. So what am I going to do to fix this? This is where I would encourage you to pause the video and see if you can troubleshoot and problem solve on your own and figure out how to solve this problem. All right, so I'm going to assume that you've paused the video, you figured it out, and you're just here to ensure that you did the problem correctly. So what I would do to solve this problem is I would come up with a little decision tree. So I would say that if my device is inverters plus site, then I need to do a SUMIF because I would only have one criteria. But if my device is not inverters plus site, if it's either inverter or site, then I need to do a SUMIFS because then I have two criteria. So I'm going to start with the function that I already wrote, but I'm going to start with an if statement. And I'm going to say that if this cell is equal to inverters plus site. Then we need to do a SUMIF. So my value if true is basically just going to be this SUMIF function. The first argument is the range, which is going to be the collection of data that we want to look for the criteria in. Remember, we only have one criteria because we're looking at both inverters and the site. So we don't have to worry about a second criteria. So our only criteria is site 1, which means that our range is going to be column A, where we can find site 1. Our criteria, like I said, is site 1, but instead of manually typing it out, I'm going to select the cell that contains site 1. Remember, like I mentioned before, whenever you select cells that are merged, you have to make sure to delete the second cell. Add a comma, and my last argument is the sum range, which is going to be the total megawatt hours. So I'm going to come back to my data and I'm going to select the entire column E. So now I'm going to close my parentheses. And when you're doing big equations like this within Excel, it's really easy to get kind of lost in the inputs. So if you ever need a little bit of guidance, just look at where you're at in this box. So my cursor is currently sitting within my if statement and in the second argument, the value if true. So essentially what I'm saying here is if I9, which is this cell right here, is equal to inverters plus site, then we're going to do a SUMIF for one criteria and just look at the total megawatt hours lost for the site that we selected. That's what this SUMIF function is saying. Don't forget to add a comma to differentiate between your arguments. If the value is false, meaning that this cell does not equal inverters plus site, then we're going to do this SUMIFs function. Now I'll just close my parentheses and hit enter. And there we go. Now we can switch between all of our inputs and get the correct answer no matter which inputs we choose. And lastly, we just need to do the same thing for the hours of downtime. If you didn't get a chance to pause the video the first time and try this problem on your own, I encourage you to take a minute, pause the video now, and try the hours of downtime on your own. It's the exact same process as the megawatt hours lost. All right, so I'm gonna assume you paused the video and you've come back just to make sure that whatever answer you got was correct. So like I said, the process is the exact same. We have a decision tree here. We need to say that if the device is equal to inverter plus site, then we only have one criteria. So we're going to do a SUMIF. Our first argument is the range, which again is just the collection of data where we can find our criteria. So remember, we only have one criteria, which is going to be the site, which means that our range is going to be in column A. Our next argument is the criteria, which we already said is site 3. So I'm going to select the cell where we can select a site. And don't forget to only select one cell. And lastly, our last argument is the sum range, which is going to be hours of downtime. So that's going to be in column D. Now I'm going to close my parentheses, which finishes off the SUMIF function. Looking back at where we're sitting in this entire if function, we are on value if true. So we completed that with the SUMIF function, which means that I need to add a column and move on to my final argument for the if function, which is value if false. So what does this mean again? The value if false is when our logical test is false. So our logical test again is that this cell is equal to inverter plus site. So if that's not the case, if this cell is not inverter plus site, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to do a SUMIFs because now we have two different criteria. So our first argument is going to be the sum range, which is going to be, in this case, the hours of downtime. So I'm going to select the entire column D. Our next argument is criteria range 1. And our first criteria is going to be solar site 1. So I'm going to select the column where I can find my first criteria, which is going to be column A. Like I said before, my criteria range 1 is site 1 or site 3, whichever selection we have made. So I'm going to select this cell. Again, make sure that you're only selecting one cell. Moving on to my fourth argument, which is criteria range 2. So my second criteria is going to be a device, which means that my criteria range is going to be my device column in column C. And lastly, my very last argument is criteria 2, which we already said is inverter. And once again, just make sure that you are only selecting one cell. Now I'm going to close all of my parentheses and hit enter. And there we go. We can select whichever site we want, whichever device we want, and our data will automatically populate with our selections. So I hope this video was helpful for you, and if it was, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe to get notified every time I post. Thanks for watching.